Yeah, Minister. Pierre is leaving, so we can talk about him now. And by the way, thank you for those remarks, Pierre. Childcare remarks notwithstanding. Okay, so what we're going to do, Q&A as always. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. And one question only, please. And a question only. Sure. Anybody has any questions? Dave?
I think it's generally accepted that we have global warming.
Yes.
But I'm certainly not sure. Is it really due to human activity, or is it a natural phenomenon as we've seen in the past? And how do we judge that? You know?
Well, both. The scientists don't agree. I mean, the scientists don't agree on where you draw the line between evolution of the planet, natural cycles, which are millennia old. I mean, we've had scientists with the ice diminishing over the poles, over our North Pole. There's been discovery of evidence of previous tropical forests going back, again, millennia, of course. But I think, that's right, and I heard a remark here, the oil sands represent that as well in terms of ancient deposits of carbon. But I think what we need to recognize is that the rest of the world and the balance of science says that we can certainly clean the atmosphere. A lot of the things that go into the atmosphere which are toxics, not just carbon dioxide, but methane, for example, methane and other ozone depleting chemicals, in fact open up things like the ozone hole that we had over the Arctic a few years ago, and those do affect the climate, those do affect the stability of our weather systems on the Earth. And while it's quite true that you can't draw a direct link between a tornado in location A and climate change, the frequency of extreme weather, extreme droughts, extreme floods, tornadoes and hurricanes in places where they never in our lifetime or in recorded history occurred before, gives some credence to the fact that if we can do something, we should do something. And certainly a lot of what Canada is doing with regards to mitigating our emissions also provide collateral health benefits, because when we capture CO2, we're also capturing a lot of toxics that are the nitrogen oxides, the sulfur oxides, even a certain amount of mercury, although most mercury in Canada comes from China, air transported from their coal-fired, and that's getting into the food chain. But if we want to twist arms from the really large polluting countries, we have to have the social license to be able to do that. We have to be able to say that the barely 2% of GHGs that Canada generates every year, if we can address our tiny 2%, then we have the social license to talk to China, that generates close to half of the world's GHGs, to do something about it, because inevitably they carry toxics into our territory.
Next question. Go ahead.
Bill? Yeah. Peter, I was going to say, I'm not a big believer in global warming stuff. There's 50,000 years of cycles. What I really would like to ask you, and what I'm more concerned is water.
Yes.
And I think the next world war is going to be fought over water. I always thought this for years. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But what can Environment Canada do about a lot of this pollution situation we find ourselves in across the country, across the world? Well, is there any policy initiatives there that can help?
Oh, no, absolutely, absolutely. And they're, well, living in this part of the country, you know exactly what the wastewater challenges are in Ottawa and region. Over the years, 75% of Canadian communities have been responsible in the way they treat their wastewater. And wastewater treatment is the secret to, it's the biggest single challenge to pure water in Canada. 75% of Canadian communities have been responsible in building adequate treatment facilities. But that other 25%, and Ottawa's in that for under treatment or no treatment, 25% of the country country's communities, large communities, Victoria, Montreal, Halifax, Ottawa, to a lesser extent. I mean, Ottawa does treat, they just don't have the capacity to treat as much as they should when we get a heavy rainstorm and there's an overflow into storm sewers. So this last summer, July, I brought down, again supported by the provinces and even by the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, although they want, of course, with a new regulation, they want the federal government to pay for it. But we brought down new wastewater management regulations, which for the worst offenders click in, they have to address those improvements by 2020. For communities like Ottawa, which have good treatment but not enough capacity, there's a few more years before they need to comply. But it's incredible, to my mind, that in 2013, there are still people in Victoria, BC, some of them are scientists, pardon me, who believe the best way to address wastewater treatment in Victoria is to build a longer pipe into the Pacific Ocean to dump raw sewage. I mean, and that is a reality. The Victoria City Council is finally building a wastewater treatment plant, which we're helping with our gas tax infrastructure rebate money, $2 billion a year. But there are still people saying, oh, let's spend it on roads and sidewalks. It's not necessary. The Pacific Ocean can accommodate all of Victoria's sewage, which is probably true if it was only Victoria, but it's a double standard, and I'm still shocked that position exists today. Another area of great concern with regards to water, and you're going to hear more about it in the next few weeks, is that we are experiencing record lows on the Great Lakes. Canada has one of the largest supplies of fresh water anywhere in the world, shared with the United States, of course. But our water levels are now at record lows on some of the lakes, all the way from Thunder Bay to Montreal, to the point that vessels arriving in Canada or loading in Canada to go abroad are having to light load by as much as 25%, otherwise they'll scrape bottom in some parts of the seaway. So the International Joint Commission is about to bring down a report with some final recommendations for us on what we might do. But I don't, oh, good heavens, it was almost done. Good heavens, it's on carpet. But the main problem is the change in precipitation over the Great Lakes. We're seeing far greater precipitation in recent years over the Maritimes. And as you know, we had a drought last year. With warmer temperatures, the Great Lakes aren't freezing, they don't have an ice cap to prevent evaporation in the cold, dry months. So there's a whole combination. But when this report comes out, believe me, it'll be headlines in the Ottawa Citizen, and we'll have to take the recommendations really seriously.
Okay, my question is, if we were to successfully do the Keystone Pipeline deal and it was all set up and running the way they thought it to be, do you think the North American continent could lose its dependency on Saudi oil permanently?
Oh, sure. Oh, no, absolutely. No, and also Eastern Canada, you know, most of our petroleum products in Eastern Canada come from abroad too.
This would be the whole North American continent with America's use.
Well, as long as the pipelines, as you know, there's an application to reverse a natural gas pipeline, line number 9, I think it is, but to get Alberta oil of all grades, heavy oil, light oil, to Eastern Canadian refiners, which are now paying a premium to buy oil from the Middle East and elsewhere. So, yeah, and Canadians in Western Canada have a price benefit because they're using domestic oil. We in Eastern Canada are reliant on imported oil. So that.
So the resistance is politically motivated.
Well, it has been. Certainly, politics is a part of it. Also, some environmental organizations would have us stick with buggy whips.
And they're holding hands with the Saudis, I imagine.
Well, there has been suggestion for conspiracy theorists that there are those in some sectors who would like to see the status quo maintained because of their share, their market share of energy. But I think, no, we're working for, carbon fuels are going to be with us for decades to come. Our challenge is to use those carbon fuels in the cleanest way possible, while at the same time, you know, and people forget this, that the exaggeration and distortion of some environmental NGOs about the oil sands, about Canada, the reality is that, again, coming back, Canada's 2% of GHG emissions annually, the oil sands are 7% of that 2%, you know, or 1/10 of 1% of the world's GHG.
So the environmentalists have been inflating their figures.
Well, they exaggerate and they distort. The reality is that 75% of the energy produced in Canada comes from clean fuels, from hydro, from nuclear, increasingly wind. Nova Scotia is getting into tidal power. They're putting generators in to use the Bay of Fundy tidal generation. We have the Lower Churchill Falls coming on, which will help Newfoundland and the Maritime provinces. So when I sat down with a bunch of my fellow environment ministers last fall in Korea, and they were all bragging about how clean their various energy percentages were. And I said, well, guess what how much of Canada's energy is clean? And one guy said, oh, 20% because of the oil sands. And somebody else said, no, to be fair, it's around 40%. And somebody else, and these were educated ministers, you know, France, Germany, Sweden, UK. And one of them finally said over 50%. And I said, well, no, Canada's clean energy generated every year is almost exactly the same as Sweden's. Above 75%, some would say 80% today, depending on, again, recession and energy use.
Because you see
So what our challenge, a lot of our challenge isn't to argue facts and science, it's basically to get out the good news of what the reality is of Canada's responsible resource.
So it'd be nice if mainstream media was your friend here. Because
Yeah,
they're just doing pictures of all the gases going in.
Well, but in defense, again, of my former colleague, the recession forced news organizations to cut. Their advertising fragmented. They